Guys, today I want to talk a bit about Turkish secular normies, but I think that you can extrapolate this to other Middle Eastern societies as well. Maybe, non-Western societies as well that are still like very, somewhat societally speaking, religious or Islamic. And the thing about secular normies is that I kind of hate this term secularism because secularism, in my opinion, like if you want to be honest to me, like, obviously, almost like statistically speaking, 70% of the Turkish population identifies as secular, right? But I feel like this is like a genuine bullshit stat because, in my opinion, like, and traveled from, Edirne to Ardahan to from Bodrum to Van. So I've basically been all over Turkey, interacted with all of different Turks, upper class, middle class, lower class, and so forth, religious and secular, nationalistic, and so forth, from all types of political ideologies and so forth. And I feel like the only people that I actually know, and I kind of like having like a conversation with those people that are actually secular. I can basically count them on one hand. No, I do know that there is like a whole philosophical movement that has like that goes beyond religion and goes beyond materialism, but and that not every atheist is a materialist and so forth. But I'm not even going to engage in those things because I feel like it's a lot of world salad and sophistry and so forth. Because this in this religion of progressivism, I would call it, it's not really like that strong, and usually it is a sign of a decaying civilization. Because I don't think that type of enlightenment thinking or what we saw in like the classical Greek tradition is not really like a very sustainable way of thinking or worldview. So when we talk about secularism, usually I try to, and again, this is not, I get it. Not every secular is like a materialist and so forth, because you can be a secular person while being a Christian, because Christianity at least allows for secularism, right? But obviously within the Islamic tradition, there is no such thing because Islam is essentially political religion. So when I often want to talk to actual atheists, and I actually have like a few atheistic friends, and a lot of people, a lot of Turks say like, no, no, I'm also an atheist, and I'm like, bro, you're not an atheist. It's like, what do you mean I'm not an atheist? And I'm like, listen, bro, your understanding of human relations, of politics, of how we basically interact with things and so forth, they're not atheistic. You still have like a very religious view on those things. Let's take one of the most obvious things, love. They might say like, you might ask them like, do you believe in love? That you can love a woman or love a man. And they say like, yeah, obviously I do believe that I can love a woman or a man. But I say like, love, essentially, according to a materialistic understanding, is nothing more than just a bunch of chemicals in your brain, right? I can give you a more crude example of like, is it like, you know, what's the difference between like Christian and insect and Christian and a human being? And, essentially there is no difference, right? According to like an entirely materialistic worldview. And these are like very vague entry level examples, but once you look at it, once you look at human relations and politics from that type of lens, then only then you can perhaps claim that you are a genuinely secular person or a genuinely atheistic person. Because if you start to or continue to think in this, oh, I don't believe in God, but I still believe in those religious principles, then you're still not really like a genuine atheist in my opinion, because you still have a religious faith in those abstract values. Another thing might be like, the belief in freedom and equality and so forth. Not only are these, connected to religions, essentially, if we to give a shout out to Friedrich Nietzsche and Carl Schmitt. But the thing is that these are obviously like secularized notions. But even if we, pretend that they're not derived from older religions, um, even then we can basically consider them a secular humanistic religion, right? So it's a religion on its own. Obviously, there is no God involved and so forth, but it's still essentially the same. For example, they might say like, we fought X side, which is truly evil, and whatever evil might mean. But they say like at least history will judge us correctly for fighting this side or fighting on this side, and this history might judge us. Seems or sounds very familiar to the God will judge us, right? So these are like delusions that we feed ourselves because essentially like there is no good or bad side in this thing, in this evolutionary tale of humanity. It's just natural selection. And a lot of these people, when it comes to like politics, human relations, and so forth, they cannot fully embrace natural selection. Only a very few people can actually do this. Now, to give you, or to stay to the topic of Turkish politics, we might, a friend of mine who is actually one of those atheistic thinking people. He once mentioned to me like, and this is a guy who is like very anti-Erdogan, and he votes royally for CHP, and he's like very opposition minded. But he also mentions that a lot of what the opposition complains about is basically not adapting to the times. So we can give two examples of this. One of it, which is a lot of secular Turks, they're mostly involved in like in the service industry, big cities. There is like this stereotype of like a office worker or a doctor that is obviously a much more secular or secular nationalistic Turk. There are, you know, these are like some of the stereotypes that exist within Turkey. And between the 1990s and the 2010s, working in these fields or in the sector, in the service sector, was obviously very beneficial because there was no AI, globalization, and so forth. So the Turkish economy was very beneficial to people that actually worked in the service industry, and that also benefited those secular segments. But nowadays, obviously, Turkey is reverting to becoming like a much more trading economy, some kind of a micro China, some might say. And the people that benefits within with Turkey being micro China are obviously the people that are engaging in trade, that are producing things and so forth. And these are obviously a bit more dominated by religious Turks, right? Or maybe like not necessarily religious Turks, but like more conservative Turks, or people that interact with the Arab world because a lot of Turkish products sell like hot cakes in the Arab world. These might be like much more religious Turks, right? So obviously, these secular Turks that work in the service sector, they're going to complain about Erdogan, and they might say like Erdogan's economic policies are extremely bad, or they might be extra hurt. Like they might they might have a point in criticizing Erdogan's economic decisions, but they don't understand that the service sector that they're in, affects them twice as hard. Not only because the changing nature of the Turkish economy, but also with artificial intelligence and so forth. So they have like this environmental bias towards it. Another example might be the demographic changes that I often mention. When I say like they say they criticize CHP, which is the traditional party of the secular nationalists, who has become much more pro-Kurdish, and I often say like this is just the natural way of things, because the Kurdish population is obviously much more younger and has grown within the Turkish Republic. So obviously, the CHP leadership is going to follow that trend and try to appeal to more Kurdish voters to gain more voters, right? And these people, they cannot understand it, because when you mention this, they'd be like, yeah, but what about the national loyalty? What about the republic and so forth? But again, like, these are abstract things. These are not actual materialistic beings, like, these are not things set in stone. These are just abstract notions that, basically can change depending on the power dynamics. But for whatever reason, like 90% of those so-called secular people, they will always like deny it. Like, they will always like try to escape from these types of conversations, because they cannot fully embrace materialism. Then eventually they will say like, yeah, but I still believe in some kind of a god, or they will trick or manipulate their brains. But again, like, this type of being like schizophrenic essentially is also like kind of stupid, because it's just like a very unsustainable ideology or worldview that eventually, even if you try to trick yourself into believing it, and if you trick other people into believing in it, t- there is there is actually like a balance between enforcing something and having like a type of ideological coherence, right? So you need to have like at least some kind of a coherence. Now, obviously, there is a balance. Like, the more powerful you are, the more you can get away with saying irrational things, and the more ideologically coherent you are, the less power you need to enforce those ideals. It's a bit of a power dynamic. I don't believe that if you have enough guns, you can basically tell that 1 plus 1 is 3. You can't really change that. But there is a fine line between those two things, and trying to trick your brain into believing that in this secular, but still believing in this religious shadows, we might call them, is a very schizophrenic way of looking at things. And it's usually like a sign of, like, we see this more commonly with like um, older Turks, and basically, unfortunately, lower IQ Turks. And I don't want to say like lower IQ, because I feel like a lot of these people are coping essentially. Like, a lot of people are coping as some kind of a survival mechanism to keep themselves alive. And but yeah, I feel like this is a very dangerous scope. I think that you need to understand that, and this is something that a lot of Turks do. You need to understand that if you want secularism, materialism, and so forth, which dominates the West, and they dominate the West within like varying degrees, obviously, right? We might say that America and certain parts of America, I mean, are obviously the much more materialistic places of the world. Dubai. We might say like the major cities like New York City, Los Angeles, London, Paris. These are all actually like genuinely the materialistic capitals of the world. And you might say like, okay, fine, I don't like it, but once you basically put your society being a train on the train rails, it's just going to go forward, right? You can't be like, oh yeah, well, I wanted, I wanted to secularize until this point, but then suddenly it has to stop, right? Like, people tend to, give the example of like sex. They might say like, yeah, fine, a little bit of premarital sex, or like dressing a little bit openly. Like, the dressing a little bit openly is like one of the most commonly cited fights within Turkey. Then there is like this woman without a headscarf, right? And within certain areas, like, if she lived in like a very conservative neighborhood, she would be like seen as like a very rebellious person or a non-traditional person, and she would be getting attacked. But at the same time, I've seen like a woman without a headscarf in the most secular areas of Istanbul or Izmir, that they are complaining about young girls dressing even more openly or being more sexually promiscuous. And it's all just relative at the end of the day, right? So the thing is, what I'm trying to say is that unfortunately, 90% of Turks or Middle Easterners, they are not really genuinely materialistic or secular. I wouldn't call them secular. Instead, they still believe in like some kind of morality, or it might be not like, I mean, like morality in the sense of some kind of, they want to believe in some kind of objective morality, or like religious notions such as free will, equality, freedom, and so forth. But again, like, it's just a cope, in my opinion. Like, eventually, on the long term, you will see that, like, in a truly atheistic and irreligious society, we will just see that humanity resorts back to natural selection and, just raw power worship. We saw this in classical Greece. We saw this in many different civilizations, that, once you take religion out of a civilization, eventually it just turns into power worship, right? So, a few genuinely materialistic minded Turks can actually see this for what it is. But for most Turks, I feel like they will just not, they're not genuinely ready to see the consequences of a genuine secular society.